thank you very, very much for coming. It's a lot of friendly and good faces that I know quite well for many, many years here. I'm very excited that you all turned out, and I hope you enjoy the program. All right, we're off to the races. So, as you can see, the title of my presentation is When We Were Bloomfield. Reading the campaign slogan, bolstering separation from Bloomfield, one can only imagine the passionate feelings it evoked. Glen Ridge for Glen Ridge, now and forever. Bloomfield for Bloomfield, as soon as we sever. Seems to hint at bloodshed. Luckily, that was not the case, but the move towards independence aroused strong sentiment on both sides of the issue. For 83 years, Glen Ridge was one of several neighborhoods of Bloomfield. Called Ridgewood in its early years after the Gallagher homestead of the same name, the town was later identified by elements of its geography. Situated on a crest along the western border of Bloomfield, Glen Ridge is split down the middle by the path of Tony's Brook. To better understand the role of Bloomfield as our forefather, it might be useful to trace the beginnings of its forefather, Newark. In 1666, 64 Puritan families from Connecticut bought land along the Passaic River from the Hackensack tribe of the Lenape Indians. They planned to establish a community in which full citizenship was granted only to members of the church. It would be the last attempt in America to establish a theocracy. The purchase included all the land. That was not fair. I can stop laughing. The purchase included all the land west of the Passaic River to present-day Caldwell, north to Clifton, and south to Elizabeth. Early residents of Glen Ridge spoke of Indian mounds in both the Upper Glen and near Mitchell Place. But actual physical evidence of Native Americans in Glen Ridge was unknown to me until 1994. That spring, Carolyn Ferguson was gardening at 60 Highland Avenue and uncovered a stemmed spear point. Its authenticity was verified by Herbert Kraft, a well-regarded New Jersey expert on the Lenape people. The implement confirmed the existence of the Lenape in this area. By 1700, the sons and grandsons of the Newark pioneers had begun to settle in present-day Bloomfield. The predominant landowners were members of the Baldwin, Dodd, Davis, Ward, and Morris families. Generations of their monuments can be seen in Bloomfield Cemetery. Attending religious services was challenging for them with impossible road conditions and only 2 churches in Newark and Orange. In 1794, the 5 named families proposed the building of a church. The parish, called the Presbyterian Society of Bloomfield, took its name from General Joseph A. Bloomfield, an officer in the War of Independence and the future 4th governor of New Jersey. General Bloomfield addressed the fledgling congregation on July 5, 1796. One account claims he gave $140 for the mortar used in building the church and 150 books to its library. In 1806, Bloomfield was commissioned as one of 3 wards of Newark. In 1812, it incorporated as a separate town. The area was over 20 square miles and included all the little settlements that today constitute Bloomfield, Belleville, Montclair, parts of the Woodside, Forest Hill sections of Newark, Franklin or Nutley, and Glen Ridge. One by one, the settlements became independent. Belleville in 1839, Montclair in 1868, Woodside in 1871, and Franklin in 1874. Glen Ridge was the last holdout. In the mid-19th century, much of Bloomfield resembled this pastoral scene by Asher Durand, depicting the lightly populated landscape of his native New Jersey. Other local artists like George Innes of Montclair and Charles Warren Eaton of Bloomfield were equally inspired by the natural beauty of this area. This restful scene of cows in the glen near Tony's Brook has a very similar feeling. The setting is a perfect place to begin a closer look at life in Glen Ridge during our time as a Bloomfield dependent. Several large farms were in operation throughout the period. Here we see the Kiner Farm at the north end of town near present-day Brookdale Park. Phineas Ward lived here at 298 Washington Street, and he farmed all the land south to present-day Carteret Street. Reverend Joseph S. Gallagher farmed his estate that we saw earlier, called Ridgewood, on Clark Street. The apple orchard on the property is now Appleton Place. Thomas Langstroth was a gentleman farmer who lived at 289 Washington Street. As an aside, the house was previously owned by William Bradbury from 1856 to 1868. The famous composer of hymns was the author of Sweet Hour of Prayer and Jesus Loves Me. He is buried in Bloomfield Cemetery. Many residents raised produce and kept animals for their own use. This house at 26 Forest Avenue was one of 3 small farmhouses at the lower end of Forest Avenue. Here we see a woman tending her cows in the backyard of 22 and 26 Forest Avenue. Early Glen Ridge also had an industrial past. In the 1830s, Bloomfield had nearly 30 mills, and 3 of them were along Tony's Brook in the Glen. Moffat's Mill was built in 1800 as a paper mill. In 1832, James Moffat converted it to a brass rolling mill, and his family continued its operation until 1897. Long after the closure of the mill, the water wheel remained on the site until a spark from a passing train set it on fire. In this scene, children overlooked the Moffat Mill Pond from a wooden bridge that was later replaced by Freeman Parkway. The mill pond was a favorite place for these children to swim until an outbreak of typhoid fever put an end to the practice. James Moffat's house and barn were located along Bloomfield Avenue. Remains of the walls that buttressed the family barn can still be seen in the Upper Glen. Mill workers lived in the upper room of the barn or in this house in the Middle Glen. They were mostly immigrants who were hired at the docks upon their arrival. These 2 decorative figures from our collection came from the Moffat home. In a sales catalog of the era, a similar pair is priced at $18. This familiar area in the Middle Glen was the site of the Brower Pasteboard Mill. It was first owned by Samuel Brower and later by Thomas C. Dodd. Here is an illustration showing the interior layout of a typical paper mill at the time. The Brower Mill operated from 1820 to 1889, making hat boxes. In an age when everyone wore hats, men, women, and children, it was a successful enterprise. Both the Browers and then the Dodds lived in this house located on the site of the present-day Ridgewood Avenue School. Here we see 3 generations of the Dodd family gathered outside the house. When construction began on the first school in Glen Ridge, the house was moved to 28 High Street, where it sits today. Dury Bromley was the owner of the 3rd mill along Tony's Brook. From 1800 to 1897, it served as a sawmill, a woolen fulling mill, and a calico dyeing mill. It was torn down in 1897 and replaced by the Power Manufacturing Company, which made bicycle chains. And with the popularity of bicycles in Glen Ridge for men, women, and children, and families, the factory must have done well. By the way, the baby on the front of the bicycle is Ruth Norton. She grew up in Glen Ridge and married Percy Wilson, who was the first Glen Ridge town historian. In 1922, the Matchless Metal Polish Company moved into that building. And this is a picture of the former factory in its second life as condominiums adjacent to the town pool. 2 other Glen Ridge mills were not along the brook. Hayden's Mill was built by Samuel Benson in 1862 and sold to Peter Hayden in 1863. Hayden made castings that were used in harnesses. With horses as the mainstay of transportation, the market for harnesses was robust. Hayden sold the factory to Thomas Edison in 1901. Edison experimented unsuccessfully on a storage battery for electric cars. This is the site on Harrell Field as it looks today. The same Samuel Benson opened another mill in 1878 for the manufacture of silver-plated copper for carriage lamp reflectors. At its closing in 1932, it made bug sprayers called flit guns. Today, the site is Clay Field. The Benson homestead was located along Bloomfield Avenue, right at the midpoint on present-day Harrell Field. A portrait of Samuel Benson's daughters, Harriet and Margaretta, hangs in the library. Finally, we should mention the Glen Ridge Quarry and Mining Company. It was located in the Lower Glen at Hillside Avenue and across Bloomfield Avenue. The Central School parking lot covers the site today. Brownstone from the quarry was used in the retaining walls of its neighbor, Bloomfield Cemetery. It can also be seen in the foundations and walls of many early homes, like this one, now gone, at 216 Ridgewood Avenue. Transporting finished goods to market was a challenge for farmers and mill owners. The 1906 opening of the Newark and Pompton Turnpike provided an east-west toll road for ox carts and farm wagons that would later be called Bloomfield Avenue. The Morris Canal also carried raw materials, finished goods, and passengers between Phillipsburg and Jersey City from 1831 to the beginning of the 20th century. Here we see a canal boat on a section of the canal in Bloomfield. The coming of the railroad did more to distinguish Glen Ridge as separate from Bloomfield as any other event. In 1856, the Newark and Bloomfield Railroad began train service to West Bloomfield, or Montclair. A timetable from 1857 shows no stops in Glen Ridge, but train riders could stand on a wooden platform in the Glen and hail the engineer who would slow down and pick them up. Soon after, a wooden bridge was built on Prospect Street to span the single track running underneath. In 1872, a picturesque small wooden station was built that served as a ticket office, agent residence, and barber shop. On the other side of town, the New York and Greenwood Lake Railroad began operations between New York and Montclair in 1872. This 1873 timetable shows a stop in Glen Ridge at Chestnut Hill. At the time, a small shed on Ridgewood Avenue near Osborne Street served as the station. Real estate developers were savvy to the implications of railroad commutation. A short while after the end of the Civil War, two men in particular had a great impact on the growth of Glen Ridge. Edward Wilde was the grandson of Herman Cadmus, whose family owned the Glen Ridge Quarry and Mining Company for several generations. He spent much of his childhood at the Cadmus House at 87 Park Avenue. In 1883, Wilde built his own house at 27 Wildwood Terrace, hence the name. Oh, am I on the wrong? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Karen. This is Wilde's house at 27 Wildwood Terrace. That same year, he put up the money to build the Chestnut Hill Station on the New York and Greenwood Lake Railroad line. Having made it possible for businessmen to commute to work and return home at the end of the day, he began to develop the north end of Glen Ridge. Houses there in the 1880s were few and far between. This photo from Highland Avenue looks east towards Ridgewood Avenue. And in the distance, you see the forest, which ultimately became Forest Avenue. Another photo from Mead Terrace looks northeast. Wilde built a house at 276 Ridgewood Avenue on speculation that was purchased by Robert Rudd, the future first mayor of Glen Ridge. This photo from Highland Avenue again looks east toward the back of the Rudd Mansion. Isabel Darwin came to Glen Ridge from Rutherford in 1877, when the south end of Glen Ridge was also ripe for development. This photo was taken at that time from the corner of Ridgewood Avenue and Windsor Place. Another photo shows the open landscape at the lower end of Ridgewood Avenue, with the original number 65 in the distance. In 1886, Darwin bought about 40 acres of the Gallagher estate on Clark Street and proceeded to build 26 houses on its adjacent streets. Darwin's own house at 204 Ridgewood Avenue was described by many as one of the most beautiful in America. It was called Sunnycrest. Darwin may have been inspired to compete with a few of his neighbors, but these homes ultimately met the same fate as Darwin's, demolition. Let's see a few of these beauties. 114 Ridgewood, 130 Ridgewood. James Moffat's married daughter lived here. 148 Ridgewood, 255 Washington Street, and 258 Washington Street, all gone. In 1887, emulating the example of Edward Wilde, Darwin financed much of the cost of building the train station on Ridgewood Avenue. It too was considered one of the finest looking stations on the Morris and Essex line. The post office in the building chose Ridgewood as its address until someone realized that there was already a Ridgewood in Bergen County, hence Glen Ridge. In 1890, Darwin built the Glen Ridge Hall for his business offices and the fledgling town library. His 1892 obituary described the populous neighborhood of Glen Ridge as his best monument. The buying and selling of these new homes required the services of a realtor, and Nathan Russell stepped into the fray. Russell was a Civil War veteran with the Massachusetts Volunteers who was seriously wounded at Port Hudson, Louisiana. In 1890, he opened a real estate office at 2628 Broad Street in Bloomfield. And 5 years later, he opened a second office on Ridgewood Avenue, adjacent to the train station. He continued the business until his death in 1917. Hundreds of his real estate photographs were salvaged from 216 Ridgewood Avenue, the one I showed you with the brownstone foundation, hours before its demolition in 1968 to build the new high school. They are now part of the historical collection at the Glen Ridge Public Library. Russell lived at 197 Ridgewood Avenue. Like most people at the time, he depended on his horse and carriage for transportation. Some residents, like the Littles on Lincoln Street, were able to afford their own driver. Others, like Bill Pearson, simply drove themselves. If you had to board your horse, Carl Sack on Herman Street was the man to see. And if a livery service was needed, William Hartley was considered very dependable. The ambulance at Mountainside Hospital and the trolley on Bloomfield Avenue were both pulled by horses. Horses also pulled the wagon that delivered flowers from Rasbach's nursery on Mayolas Avenue. Vendors of vegetables, poultry, milk, fish, bananas, and ice brought these goods and others to housewives every day by horse and wagon. With a common dependence on the use of horses, barns were a practical necessity. But to children, they were like a playground, an enchanting place to play cops and robbers, hare and hound, and swing from the ropes that were used to pull up the bales of hay. If the family goat was agreeable, children might recruit him to pull them in a cart. On summer days, children played in the glen, picking wildflowers, jumping the stones in Tony's Brook, and catching eels. And in winter, they might have skated on the Morris Canal. Football and baseball were popular with the boys, and organized teams played at the outing grounds on Lincoln Street. Miss Rouget's dancing class appealed to the girls, and boys and girls worked together in stage theatricals like Cinderella in Glen Ridge Hall. Children being children, they needed to go to school. In 1887, Henrietta Northall opened a school for the youngest children at the Gallagher homestead. She moved it to the Glen Ridge Hall when the Clark Street property was taken over by the Glen Ridge Congregational Church. Older children went to the Center Primary School on Liberty Street in Bloomfield. It was a challenge for students to make the round-trip walk in the morning and the afternoon and even at lunchtime. Picnics were a favorite family pastime. The Brewer family is seen here enjoying lunch at their country house, but newspaper accounts tell us that the woods on Woodland Avenue were a favorite local place to picnic. Lawn gatherings like this one on Snowden Place were an occasion for neighbors to plan the church bazaar or hospital fair. Reading together and knitting were apparently de rigueur for the Brewers. Not surprisingly, there were several book clubs at the time and a needlework guild as well. Outside the home, Glen Ridge residents socialized at the Glen Ridge Club, ultimately known as the Glen Ridge Men's Club. Its calendar was booked with dances, lectures, concerts, musicals, and holiday parties, including a leap year dance. Men could bowl, play billiards and whist, and smoke cigars. The club was located where the Glen Ridge Post Office is today. Across the street at the Glen Ridge Hall, there were other social opportunities, including theatrical tableaux, book discussions, spelling matches, and dances for young singles. Residents who enjoyed tennis could play at the lawn tennis clubs on Clark Street or Glen Ridge Avenue. There were also a fair number of private courts. Golfers, too, were fortunate. The Glen Ridge Country Club was organized in 1894 with a 9-hole course at Bay and Ridgewood Avenues. After using a small outbuilding on the nearby Innes Estate as their original clubhouse, they built this attractive building on Oxford Street in 1900. Sport of a different kind took place at the Slayback House on Highland Avenue. The house was a starting point for fox hunters and their hounds as they chased across the fields towards present-day Brookdale Park. The spiritual needs of Glen Ridge residents were also being met. The first worship service at the Glen Ridge Congregational Church was held in 1890 on property given by the Gallagher family. And after fire destroyed its original church on Liberty Street in Bloomfield, Christ Episcopal Church opened its doors on Easter Sunday in 1894. Its interior stones were the last to be taken out of the quarry nearby. In spite of these many opportunities in Glen Ridge for social, cultural, educational, athletic, and spiritual participation, by 1885, an atmosphere of discontent had begun to build. The Glen Ridge Original, a short-lived newspaper of 1 year in 1890, began to publish secessionist views. Among its complaints were impossible road conditions like these on Highland Avenue. Sidewalks were either cinders, wooden boards with bees' nests underneath, or non-existent. Water mains were few and water pressure was often dangerously low. Sewers were promised but never installed. Land set aside on Hillside Avenue for a public school remained an empty lot. Dissidents felt that a greater portion of the $30,000 in annual taxes should be spent on improvements in Glen Ridge. The Bloomfield citizens saw things differently. It claimed that a feeling of social superiority to Bloomfield really exists in Glen Ridge and is beyond a doubt the nucleus of the borough movement. After 5 years of agitation, a date was set for the election, Tuesday, February 12, 1895. The Boroughwites used Glen Ridge Hall as their canvassing headquarters. The anti-Boroughwites gathered in the railroad station. Voting took place at the stone building, now gone, behind the Glen Ridge Club, and of course, only the men could vote. Each voter indicated his choice on a small paper that was put in an envelope and slipped into the ballot box. When the 315 votes were tallied, the count was close: 165 in favor of incorporation and 142 against, a mere margin of 23 votes. The victory did not sit well with Bloomfield. It was difficult to set their last dependent free. The decision was fought in the courts for nearly 15 years. Legal challenges notwithstanding, residents moved quickly to elect Robert S. Rudd as mayor of the newly incorporated borough. In his inaugural address to the first borough council, Rudd proclaimed, "We may confidently hope that Glen Ridge will be a residence section second to none." Perhaps this photograph of the newly constructed Glen Ridge School, as it looked upon its opening in the fall of 1900, is a perfect place to conclude our reminiscence of when we were Bloomfield. Its solid presence on the hill, where it still sits today, seems to confirm that now we are Glen Ridge. Thank you very much.